Rain slicked the Brooklyn street, neon from Sal's deli sign twitching like a dying heartbeat. The loyal enforcer stepped from the shadows, coat heavy with water, breath fogging in the cold night. A black sedan screeched to a halt, its headlights slicing through the mist. A door slammed. "Get down," a voice barked from somewhere behind. But the warning came too late. A single gunshot tore through the air, sharp as glass breaking. He spun, catching sight of the lifeless body collapsing onto wet asphalt, crimson spreading toward the gutter. Dropping to his knees, his hands trembled as they found the crucifix, still warm in the victim's grip. "Stay with me," he whispered, voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. Somewhere a woman screamed, a sound so raw it cut through the rain. Sirens wailed in the distance, but he knew help wouldn't come in time, not the kind that mattered. His eyes lifted, locking onto a figure at the far end of the block. The silhouette didn't run. It just stood there, watching, until the fog swallowed it whole. The funeral smelled of lilies and lies. Every handshake was stiff, every hug calculated. The boss stood at the podium, his voice dripping with warmth as he painted the dead man as a brother, a soldier, a saint. The loyal enforcer felt the words like acid, each sentence wrapping around his throat like a noose. "He died protecting what mattered," the boss said, eyes sweeping the mourners with a practiced sadness. The pews creaked as people shifted uncomfortably. A hand touched his shoulder, the confidant eyes softer than he remembered, lips barely moving. "Midnight. At the club," she murmured, slipping a folded note into his palm. He kept his face still, hiding the sudden tremor in his hand. Outside the rain had stopped, but the air still felt heavy, thick with the scent of damp stone and something far darker. The club's back room hummed with low jazz and whispered deals. The confidant leaned against the table, cigarette smoke curling upward like secrets she wasn't ready to share. "You're being watched," she said, her voice barely above the music. The loyal enforcer kept his gaze on the glass in front of him, whiskey catching the amber glow of the single lamp. "By who?" he asked. She smiled faintly, not with joy but with resignation. "By everyone." Outside, muffled laughter mixed with the clink of glasses, but in here, every word felt dangerous. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to him. "Don't trust the detective," she whispered. "He's not here to save you, he's here to sell you." He didn't flinch, but inside, the walls were already closing in. The detective was waiting by the docks, cigarette glowing in the fog like a lighthouse for trouble. "You want answers," he said, flicking ash into the black water, "but answers have prices." The loyal enforcer stood still, the salt wind cutting through his coat. "Name it." The detective's smirk was more warning than humor. "Silence when I tell you. Action when I say." A ship's horn groaned in the distance, the sound of steel chains rattling against the pier. Somewhere in the fog, footsteps echoed, too heavy to be coincidence. The detective didn't turn his head, just muttered, "We ain't alone." He found the note again that night, smoothing its creases under the yellow kitchen light. The words were short, almost careless. "Meet me where it started." He knew the place, the warehouse on 14th Street, where he'd earned the boss's trust all those years ago. Back then, it had been blood and loyalty that bound them. Now, it was betrayal and debt. He poured himself another drink, the ice cracking in the glass, and stared out the window at the sleeping city. Somewhere out there, the truth waited like a blade in the dark. Morning broke like a bad alibi, thin light peeling off wet brick and rusted fire escapes. The loyal enforcer walked the route the shooter took, counting steps like rosary beads. He mapped the angles, the line of fire, the blind corners. He muttered, "No panic, no scramble," and the words tasted of smoke. The corner bodega owner stared too long, then looked away, and that told him enough. The confidant called, her voice tight with caution. She said, "They know you're asking the wrong question." He answered, "Then I'll ask louder," but his chest felt like a locked vault. A patrol car idled by, and the crooked detective lifted two fingers in a lazy salute. He said, "Careful where you dig." he replied. Careful what you bury, and cut the line. A pigeon flapped up from a rain barrel, startling him into stillness. He breathed once, deeply, then pocketed a shard of headlight glass and walked on. He met the crooked detective under the L where steel screamed with every passing train. The detective said, "There's a ledger, kid, and it bleeds numbers that smell like Afghan poppy." He kept his face still and asked, "Where?" The detective smiled like a dull knife. He said, "You already know where. 14th Street, East Bay door." A train roared overhead and shook the dust loose like confetti from a mean parade. He asked, "Price?" The detective exhaled and flicked ash. He said, "You don't know it yet, but it's you." He felt the words crawl under his skin and settle. He said, "If this is a play, pick a side." The detective laughed softly. He said, "I pick winners." The train noise faded, leaving only his heart counting seconds he could not afford. The confidant waited in a laundromat that doubled as a whisper bank. Dryers thumped like anxious hearts and detergent perfumed the lies. She said, "He knows you will go to the warehouse." He watched the dryer window turn like a slow coin. He said, "Then he wants me there." She nodded once, eyes rimmed with sleepless steel. She said, "There's a back stair locked from the inside, but the lock is old." He asked, "Why help me?" She looked at her reflection in the glass and flinched. She said, "Because I am tired of burying the wrong men." The door chimed, and a man with a newspaper paused, listening too hard. He said, "We are done," and placed quarters on the table. She said, "Take this," and slid a brass key that felt heavier than truth. He tailed the sedan that had ghosted the block, keeping 2 cars back and 1 street over. The city moved like a chessboard, where every pawn carried a blade. He said to himself, "No mistakes," and the mantra steadied his hands. The sedan turned toward the river roads and vanished behind a chain of warehouses. He parked near a loading dock, listening to the rain return in thin needles. Footsteps tapped in the dark, too light to be dockmen, too patient to be drunk. He slipped behind a stack of pallets and tasted dust and salt. A flashlight beam swept past, slow as a tide. A voice said, "He's here." He tightened his grip and counted down from 5. When he reached 1, he was already moving. He reached the warehouse on 14th with the brass key warm in his palm. The East Bay door groaned like a wounded animal, and then yielded. Inside, the air carried oil, rope, and something sweet that did not belong. He whispered, "Show me," and the darkness obliged. He found the back stair and the old lock surrendered to the key with a tired sigh. Upstairs, a desk waited under a single bulb. The ledger lay open like a throat. Columns marched in neat ink, names masked by initials, numbers climbing like fever. He traced a line and froze at a familiar set of marks. The boss had signed this page in a hurry, a flourish like a snake's tail. He said, "You always overplayed the ending," and photographed every sheet. The photographs burned in his pocket like live coals. The loyal enforcer walked straight from the warehouse to the confidant's place, a 5th-floor walk-up where shadows clung to the walls like old debts. She opened the door without speaking, her eyes flicking to the street before pulling him inside. He laid the photos on the table, the ledger's ink stark under the single hanging bulb. She traced the boss's signature with 1 finger, her jaw tightening. "It's him," she said, voice low but steady. He said, "It's always been him." The clock on the wall ticked too loudly, each second another nail. She looked at him and asked, "What now?" He answered, "We find the chain and cut it at the throat." She said nothing, only poured 2 glasses of rye, her hands trembling just enough to betray the fear she refused to name. The crooked detective was waiting in a diner that smelled of burnt coffee and old cigarettes. He said, "You stirred the pot," without looking up from his plate. The loyal enforcer slid into the booth opposite, eyes scanning the door. "You gave me the recipe," he said. The detective smirked and forked cold eggs. "That ledger will get you killed," he replied, "or it will get him buried." The waitress, a woman with tired eyes, topped off their cups, not hearing or pretending not to. The detective leaned in, lowering his voice. Names on that list belong to more than just your boss. Touch one and you'll set fire to the city. He smiled without humor. Then we'll see who burns first. The confidant called him to a bridge that groaned under the weight of midnight traffic. She was already there, leaning against the railing, the city lights painting her face in gold and shadow. "There's someone else," she said. "An inside man." He stepped closer, the wind whipping their coats. "Name?" She shook her head. "Not yet, but he's closer to you than you think." A horn blared below, and the sound felt like a warning. She reached into her pocket and handed him a scrap of paper with 3 numbers scrawled in ink. "Locker code," she said. "Inside you'll find proof." He studied her face, searching for doubt, but found only urgency. She whispered, "Don't go alone." The locker was buried in the back of a bus terminal, metal dented and numbers worn thin. He spun the dial slow, listening for the clicks, and the door gave way with a sigh. Inside was a small envelope, lighter than expected. He opened it and found a single photograph, the boss shaking hands with a man he'd once called brother. The setting was the same warehouse he'd been in hours ago, but years earlier. In the background, a crate was stenciled with a poppy flower and foreign script. He said aloud, "Heroin," and the word felt like a verdict. A cough behind him snapped him back. He turned, hand on his coat, but the space was empty, for now. Back in his apartment, he pinned a photograph to the wall beside the ledger copies. Threads of red twine connected dates, names, and locations like veins feeding a single heart. The boss's smile in the photograph mocked him from across the years. He poured himself a drink, the rye biting harder than before, and sat in the dark. Through the window, he saw the same black sedan from that night, idling at the corner, exhaust curling into the street lamp glow. He didn't move. He just sipped, eyes locked on the car until it rolled away. The glass was empty before the silence felt safe again. Confidant's voice on the phone was barely a whisper. "He knows you have the photo." The loyal enforcer stared at the city lights from the fire escape, rain slicking the iron beneath his boots. "Then the clock just got faster," he said. She told him the boss was moving the next shipment tonight. Same warehouse, different crew. He asked, "Why tell me?" She replied, "Because you'll go anyway." He hung up without goodbye and lit a cigarette, letting the smoke mix with the drizzle. Below, a dark figure leaned against a lamppost, face hidden by the brim of a hat. He knew they were watching, measuring how much time he had left. The crooked detective found him in a parking garage that smelled of oil and dust. "You're about to step on landmines," he said. The enforcer replied, "Then you better clear me a path." The detective shook his head. "Not my job." He offered a folded map, edges frayed, marking routes to avoid and doors to watch. "You didn't get this from me," he warned. The enforcer took it, tucking it inside his coat. A car door slammed in the shadows and footsteps echoed between concrete pillars. The detective muttered, "We're done," and melted into the dark before the owner of those footsteps could appear. He reached the warehouse just before midnight, crouching in the lee of a rusted freight container. Across the yard, men loaded crates into the back of a truck, their movements quick and deliberate. The poppy logo glared white against the dark wood. He whispered, "Got you," and began snapping photos. A voice cut the air, "Drop it." He turned slowly, finding himself face to face with a younger soldier, nervous finger on the trigger. "You don't want this," the enforcer said, his tone flat but steady. The kid's eyes darted toward the truck, then back. The moment hung like a frayed rope. The confidant's key had one more use, a side door tucked under a sagging awning. He slipped inside and found himself in a maze of stacked pallets and hanging chains. Above, footsteps thudded across catwalks. He moved slow, counting steps until voices filtered down. One of them was the boss. "Make sure the ledger's gone," the boss said, each word carrying ice. He froze in the shadow of a stack, listening as Boots passed within feet of him. When the voices faded, he moved again, quieter this time, toward the sound of an office door clicking shut. The office reeked of stale smoke and cheap cologne. The boss sat behind a steel desk, reading a file. He didn't look up when the enforcer stepped inside. "You've been busy," the boss said, his voice carrying the weight of a verdict. The enforcer closed the door, the click loud in the stillness. "You killed him," he said. The boss finally raised his head, a faint smile playing at his lips. "And you're still here." For a long moment, neither moved. Outside, rain hammered the tin roof, drowning the sound of their breathing. The enforcer's hand hovered near his coat, and the room grew tighter, the air heavier. Rain hammered the roof while the boss watched him like a jeweler weighing a flawed gem. The loyal enforcer said, "You silenced a brother to save a shipment." The boss closed the file and smiled without light. He said, "I saved an empire and a future you could share." Thunder rolled, dragging the moment longer than breath. The enforcer stepped closer, coat dripping, hand hovering near the holster that felt like a verdict. He said, "Offer it again. But tell the truth first." The boss leaned back, the chair creaking like an old confession. He said, "You want justice, I want quiet, the city wants money." Outside, a truck coughed to life and men shouted, hurrying cargo through sheets of rain. The boss added, "Take the East Borough, take the port, take a crown you already wear." The enforcer stared at the ledger copy in his mind and felt the crucifix burn his palm. He said, "Crowns are heavy when they hide a bullet hole." The boss shrugged, as if absolution were a casual coat. He said, "Then wear a hat." The door burst inward before a decision could breathe. A soldier yelled, "Gun!" and the office detonated into motion. The enforcer pivoted, shouldered the frame, and the first shot took the lamp into darkness. The room became a moving bruise lit by lightning through the rain-washed window. The boss dove behind the desk, cursing with elegant rage. The enforcer said, "You brought witnesses to a confession," and his voice steadied his hands. Muzzle flashes stitched the walls with white scars. He rolled, clipped a shin, and heard a body fold hard. Glass shattered, cold water spraying the room like a baptism no one asked for. Boots thundered in the hall, then slowed when silence did not return their courage. He kicked the desk, sent it skidding, and the boss slipped out the side door like a rumor. The enforcer stood, breath iron and smoke, and followed the echo of retreat. He bled a quiet line across the catwalks, and found the side exit breathing fog. The confidant waited under a leaky awning, eyes like sleepless knives. She said, "You're hit," and pressed a cloth to his shoulder before he could refuse. He said, he ran for the river trucks, and the words steamed in the cold. She tightened the bandage with a steadiness born from too many nights like this. She said, "I parked by the pilings, keys are warm." Sirens grazed the distance, thin as a lie told twice. He asked, "Why keep helping a man who might not come back?" She said, "Because you still look backward when you raise the gun." He almost smiled and felt the cut of it. He said, "Then keep me honest." And they moved together, shadow to shadow, toward the water that swallowed every oath. The crooked detective idled beside the pier in a sedan that smelled like old victories. He said, "You made a mess," and the wipers kept time like a metronome for bad decisions. The enforcer slid into the passenger seat, damp and silent. He said, "You knew the side door." The detective did not flinch. He said, "I know all doors when the boss pays me to count keys." The confidant stood outside the window, rain striping her face into war paint. She said, "He is the inside man." And the words didn't echo because the car swallowed them whole. The detective sighed, weary rather than guilty. He said, "I sell weather reports, not storms." The enforcer showed the ledger photo, the signature curled like a hook. He said, "Forecast this," and the detective finally blinked. He said, "Truck leaves in 5, Pier 3. After that, you drown or you crown." They reached Pier 3, as forklifts beeped like heart monitors losing faith. The truck idled with its tailgate raised like a jaw. The boss stood beneath a tarred canopy, umbrella tilting like a crown that would not sit straight. The enforcer said, "You run on numbers and ghosts," and stepped into the spill of white work lights. The boss answered, "I run on men who choose survival." The confidant moved to the flank, hand inside her jacket, where bravery kept its last cigarette. The detective hovered at the edge, appetite fighting caution. The enforcer raised the ledger copies, paper fluttering, and the dock crew faltered one step. He said, "This buys your freedom if you walk now." The boss laughed softly, and it sounded like brass being polished for a funeral. He said, "They walk when I bury you." The harbor wind tore the words apart, but the guns understood every syllable. The first shot cracked a pier open like a dropped bottle. Men scattered, shouting into the rain, their shapes blurring under the floodlights. The loyal enforcer dove behind a pallet of rope, splinters biting through wet sleeves. The boss's voice cut through the chaos, low, calm, like a man ordering dessert. "End him." Bullets chewed into wood, sending shreds and rope fibers into the air. The confidant yelled his name from the left flank, her voice raw with urgency. He crawled toward the sound, water sloshing under his knees. The crooked detective crouched behind a forklift, torn between fight and flight. The enforcer rose in a burst, firing twice, dropping one man, wounding another. "Push them to the trucks," he barked, and the confidant's answering shots rang out like punctuation. The boss retreated toward the truck, flanked by two guards who fired in short bursts. The enforcer moved in a zigzag sprint, using containers for cover. A flash of lightning illuminated the confidant cutting across the pier, closing the angle. "You can't box him alone," she shouted, but her words vanished under gunfire. He slid into cover behind a metal drum, reloading with fingers that knew no hesitation. One guard fell, his body skidding across slick planks. The boss didn't look back. The detective, now in the open, fired a single precise shot that clipped the second guard's knee. The enforcer's eyes met his, and for one heartbeat, they were on the same side. The enforcer closed in, his boots slipping on wet boards. He shouted, "Drop it or you go in the water." The boss turned slowly, umbrella tilting, lips curling into that same old smile. "You won't," he said almost gently. The confidant emerged behind him, gun steady. "Try me," she said. The detective edged closer from the side, his revolver leveled but his eyes unreadable. Rain blurred the lines between allies and targets. The boss let the umbrella fall, exposing silver hair plastered to his skull. "Then do it," he said, voice steady as stone. The enforcer's finger tightened, his mind replaying the crucifix in his palm, the blood in the gutter, the ledger's curling ink. The boss moved first, not for a weapon but for the truth. "Your brother's blood bought you this moment," he said. The words hit harder than any slug. The enforcer's grip faltered just enough. The detective's gun snapped upward, but his eyes flicked toward the boss, hesitation pulling his aim. The confidant's voice cut through. "Finish it." Thunder rolled over the harbor as if the sky wanted the answer too. The boss stepped closer, defiance in every stride. "Kill me, and you take my seat. Don't, and you'll never get another shot." The enforcer felt the weight of choice like a chain around his neck. Gunfire ripped the tension apart. The detective fired first, the shot taking the boss in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. The enforcer's follow-up hit center mass, sending him collapsing onto the wet planks. The confidant moved instantly, kicking his gun away, and kneeling beside him. "You could have been more," she whispered. His eyes closed without answering. The enforcer stood in the rain, chest heaving, knowing the throne was his if he wanted it. The detective holstered his gun without a word, and walked toward the shadows. Cranes groaned in the distance, as the crew scattered into the night. The crucifix felt heavier now, but he kept it in his pocket. Dawn crept over the harbor like a tired witness, pale light bleeding into the mist. The loyal enforcer stood alone where the boss had fallen, the rain easing into a thin drizzle. The confidant's voice broke the silence. "It's over," she said, though it sounded like a question. He shook his head. "It never is." The crooked detective had vanished before sunrise, leaving only tire tracks in the wet gravel. Seagulls circled overhead, their cries sharp as broken glass. The enforcer reached into his coat and pulled out the crucifix, its metal still flecked with dried blood. "This was his," he said quietly. She nodded but didn't take it. The water below lapped at the pier like it was trying to pull the night back under. They walked from the pier in silence, the city awakening in the distance with the grind of trucks and the hiss of steam vents. The enforcer lit a cigarette, offering it to the confidant, but she waved it away. "I'm done with smoke," she said. He smiled faintly, knowing she meant more than tobacco. A newsboy cycled past with headlines folded under his arm, none yet telling their story. They crossed a street slick with last night's rain, their reflections stretching in the puddles like strangers walking beside them. She asked, "What will you do now?" He answered, "That depends on who comes for me first." The apartment felt smaller than before, walls heavy with the smell of damp wool and old rye. He hung his coat by the door, the crucifix laid on the table like an unspoken oath. He pinned the final photograph beside the ledger copies, red twine connecting every name, every place, every death. The confidant leaned against the doorway, watching without speaking. "You've built yourself a throne of paper," she finally said. He replied, "And now I decide if I burn it or sit on it." She stepped closer, her boots silent on the worn floorboards. "Just remember, crowns cut deeper than bullets." He returned to the docks alone that night, the water black and restless under the moon. Standing at the pier's edge, he held the crucifix in one hand and the lighter in the other. For a moment, the wind threatened to snatch both. He thought of the men buried under his choices, the ledger's ink outlasting their names. "You keep them," he said to the water, and dropped the crucifix. It vanished without a ripple. The lighter clicked, flame catching the edges of a single ledger page. The fire flared, reflected in his eyes before the wind tore it away. The fog was thick by morning, swallowing the streets until the city felt like it belonged only to him. He walked toward the river, each step quiet in the damp. Somewhere, a church bell tolled, slow and deliberate. His thoughts were not of crowns or ledgers now, but of survival, of whether his own name would one day be strung on someone else's wall with red twine. He paused at the pier, the mist wrapping him in its cold arms. A voice in his head said, "In this city the only oath that matters is the one you take with yourself." He lit a cigarette and walked forward, disappearing into the gray.